A lot of people are going to find the Home Office's plan to force asylum seekers onto a barge pretty disturbing. That's a fact that Talk TV's Julia Hartley-Brewer brought up to her guest. He's former UKIPper, Stephen Wolfe, who's now refashioned himself as an expert on migration.
It does have the look. We've got it up on the screen now. What this vessel will look like. I mean, it's not a cruise liner. It does have a sort of a prison ship kind of look about it. There'll be a lot of people that will say, "Well, that's going to deter people if they think that's where they're going to end up." Is it appropriate accommodation? I mean, there'll be people. I mean, maybe they won't house families, but we know, that there will also be some migrant families coming. Is this an appropriate, safe place for people to be housed? I mean, what outdoor space have you got? How are you going to walk? I mean, get exercise. I mean, we can look after our own prisoners who've been convicted of serious crimes better than this, don't we?
Well, perhaps we do, but I was reviewing the Facts Centre on the UNHCR site this morning, and it makes it very clear that there is no requirement or obligation under the convention for people to be housed in houses or hotels. And in fact, when you look at the thousands of asylum seekers and displaced persons that the UNHCR is looking after across the globe, particularly places in Africa, you could look at Pakistan and to an extent Iran, you see really large tented communities out there. So in comparison to the tented communities in hot areas, this is a luxury for those who are fleeing torture.
You could apply that to any aspect of British society, right? You say, "Oh, our prisons are a little bit overcrowded." Well, if you look in a war zone, prisoners of war don't tend to have such a nice digs for them to hang out in. I mean, he's literally pointing to places where there are humanitarian crises and saying, "Well, they live in tents there. Can't they live in tents here?" It's like, well, no, because we haven't just suffered a natural disaster. Right? We aren't a war zone. We're actually a very rich country. And so he shouldn't be taking inspiration from the refugee camps that you see in places that are, that are suffering crises, right? It's like he watched the documentary about Shamima Begum and thinks, well, they live in tents in Syria. Why can't we just have everyone in tents in this country? Well, for one, this is quite a cold country. And two, we don't need to because we're very wealthy, right? The idea that now we're setting our standards for how people should live by looking at some of the poorest countries in the world and saying that will do here. I mean, by the way, Iran isn't necessarily one of the poorest countries in the world. What he's naming, I mean, seems a little bit random to me. But clearly the message he is sending is, well, they should be lucky. If they're living in tents, that's all good. We can do better than that. I mean, what did you think of that, Dahlia? What do you think of that comment?
Well, for me, what I thought was really interesting, I mean, obviously, so this is Stephen Wolfe, right? So he was at some point, I believe, seen to be a successor for Nigel Farage. He's essentially a UKIP politician, right? That's what he is. The main reason I know who he is because he got smacked by one of his fellow UKIP, but that's a conversation for another day. So he's now founded this think tank, Centre for Migration and Economic Progress, which, first of all, the syntax of that is completely messed up. But again, that's a conversation for another day. But the question to me is, who is this guy? What is this think tank? So there are 3 people listed on this think tank, none of whom have got any expertise or evidence of having ever engaged in migration issues beyond as, hot takey politicians. There's no expertise in academic issues of migration. There's no evidence that they have ever worked with migrants. It's literally just 3 people, 2 of whom just have history of working in the big city. One as a lawyer for big banks. The other one is an entrepreneur. And then you have another researcher who, again, has absolutely no research portfolio, let alone to do with migration. So this is an institution that has no obvious qualifications to be talking about migration from any perspective other than just simply having a political agenda around migration. And yet they are able to take up space in the media. Of course, it is on Julia Hartley-Brewer's show. So she's obviously going to go towards people who prop up her particular agenda. But essentially, these organizations, this kind of ecosystem of right-wing think tanks that have emerged over the past, I would say, 20 years, who are able to take up space and essentially subsidize the ability of right-wing people to take up space in the media, to create and constantly repeat certain framings around the economy, around migration, and yet to be put forward as, simply academic positions, as people who have done the research and have come up with these conclusions. That is not the case. This is simply it's basically a shell company for, a political campaign in order to achieve particular political goals that are not especially motivated by any kind of empirical research. The think tank that this reminded me of was Migration Watch, which is, again, a very opaque, very, non-transparent think tank that has been cited by mainstream media as a kind of independent, apolitical research institute, and has been cited over and over and over again. I feel like there was one study, don't quote me on this, but there was one study that found that Migration Watch had been quoted in something like 600 stories in the BBC in 1 year, which is wild, or at least one story a day in 1 year on the BBC. And yet there is no transparency about who is funding, who is financing these think tanks, what is their political leaning? What are their political agendas? And what qualifies them to be considered as experts on these issues? And that has had a really sinister effect on shifting the Overton window, particularly around questions of migration, very much to the right. I think a lot of the shifts that we are seeing, the shift rightwards on migration, has been directly related to the growing influence of think tanks like Migration Watch. And I feel like this organization that Stephen Wolfe has set up is basically trying to be a pound shop version of that. And so to me, that was really the interesting thing about this clip, because I was like, why is this guy being reframed as a migration expert when he's an anti-immigration politician, anti-immigration campaigner? That's actually what he has cut his teeth doing. So I think it's interesting that kind of rebrand, and we should always be really wary by this ecosystem of think tanks whose funding is not transparent, whose political objectives are not transparent, but have been really shaping the Overton window and, again, the political direction of this country, and particularly over the past 2 decades.
Good idea to look into this organization, Dalia. I feel like I should have done that when I was researching this section, but it's called the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. I've just Googled it. So you can go onto it and you say about us. They've got our wonderful team is Stephen Wolfe with one other researcher. She's called Claire Colgan. And this is a good one. Our advisory board. So an advisory board, you expect to see a number of people with, various qualifications to make them a legitimate oversight board for this organization. It's Stephen Wolfe and one other person. So the staff is Stephen Wolfe and one other person. The advisory board is Stephen Wolfe and one other person. And then contributors, you've got Stephen Wolfe and 2 other people. So this is, this basically just looks like an organization that lets Stephen Wolfe go on television and go on the radio and say, I'm representing, fair play to him. They've come up with a pretty legitimate sounding name, the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. Yes, I trust what they have to say. They sound like experts on migration, and I love economic prosperity, so why not listen to these people? But I think you're exactly right, Dalia. This does not seem like an organization that we should necessarily be taking their word when it comes to migration or anything, in fact, because Stephen Wolfe is fundamentally a politician, right? He's an ex-politician, and it seems pretty odd to be introducing him as a migration expert.